Double lock, suspect cruiser 2032. Got it.
The courtyard was loud, but no one was afraid. Arguments were common here. Voices rose, tempers flared, and then life moved on. That night felt no different until the sound that didn't belong shattered everything. A single gunshot, then another. Within seconds, Clark Gardens transformed from a neighborhood gathering place into a scene of pure panic. People ran, children screamed, bodies scattered in every direction. And in the middle of it all, a young mother collapsed. She was carrying her toddler. She was 4 months pregnant. She wasn't part of the fight. When police arrived, they found chaos without clarity, dozens of witnesses, more than 70 shell casings, and one devastating question that would drive the entire investigation. Who fired the first shot? Because in a crowded courtyard where many guns went off, only one bullet changed everything. This is the story of how a neighborhood dispute spiraled into irreversible loss, how truth hid behind fear and silence, and how investigators unraveled a single moment that destroyed a family forever. Clark Gardens was loud that evening, but it wasn't unusual. Kids ran between parked cars, adults stood in clusters, talking, arguing, laughing. Voices rose and fell the way they often did in this apartment complex. Disagreements were common. Shouting was familiar. Most residents had learned to tune it out. Nothing about the night suggested it would end in blood. Among the people outside was Ariel Thump Calloway. She was 24 years old, 4 months pregnant, and focused on one thing: getting her toddler home. Witnesses later described her as calm, protective, and gentle. She wasn't involved in the tension building across the courtyard. She wasn't arguing with anyone. She wasn't shouting back and forth. She was just being a mother. Earlier that evening, there had been a fight between several women near the playground area. Police had already come once, spoken to people, and left after things appeared to settle. But residents would later say the energy never really cooled. The arguments didn't disappear. They paused. People regrouped. The crowd shifted. Voices started up again. Ariel stayed on the edges of it all. Her son had been playing near a white truck, and when the noise began to grow louder, she picked him up. Multiple witnesses recalled hearing her say she was taking him inside. She had already started walking away. Then the first gunshot rang out. At first, people hesitated, but hesitation vanished when the second shot followed almost immediately, and then the courtyard exploded. Gunfire ripped through the space. People ran in every direction. Some dropped to the ground. Others sprinted for cover between buildings and cars. Screams cut through the noise as more shots echoed off concrete and brick. In the middle of the chaos, Ariel was hit. She collapsed near the center of the courtyard. Her body gave way, and her toddler was pulled from her arms as people rushed toward her. Blood pooled on the pavement. Someone screamed for help. Someone else yelled to get back. By the time the first officers arrived, the scene was already out of control. Neighbors crowded in despite commands to move away. People cried, others argued. Shoes and phones lay abandoned where people had dropped them while running. No one could give police a clear answer. Everyone had seen something. No one had seen the same thing. Officers quickly learned that Ariel had been shot while carrying her child. Medics worked desperately at the scene before rushing her to the hospital. Meanwhile, police tried to establish where the gunfire had started. That proved almost impossible. Witnesses pointed in opposite directions. Some said the shots came from near the playground. Others insisted they came from the roadway. A few claimed gunfire came from inside an apartment. Names were mentioned, then withdrawn. Nothing lined up. Shell casings were scattered across the courtyard, dozens of them. Investigators would later count more than 70 rounds fired that night. 70 bullets discharged in a crowded residential complex, yet only one person had been struck. That fact immediately stood out. With that many shots fired, with that many people present, how was Ariel the only one hit? At the hospital, doctors fought to save her life. She arrived with gunshot wounds to the chest. Her heart stopped during transport. Despite every attempt to revive her, they couldn't bring her back. Her unborn child did not survive either. When her family was told, grief hit instantly and violently. Screams echoed through the hospital corridors. Shock turned into sobbing. Disbelief followed by collapse. Ariel was gone. Back at Clark Gardens, detectives faced a second challenge beyond identifying the shooter, getting people to talk. Some residents hesitated before answering even basic questions. Others stopped mid-sentence and looked around before continuing. In communities like this, cooperation can come with consequences. Being labeled a snitch carries weight. That fear shaped the investigation from the start. Officers began canvassing apartments closest to where Ariel fell. Inside one unit, they found multiple men gathered together. Firearms were recovered inside the apartment. That alone made everyone inside a person of interest, either as a shooter or as someone protecting one. Detectives applied pressure. They weren't looking for excuses. They wanted one answer. Who fired first? If someone inside the apartment had returned fire, they needed to say it. If someone had fired initially from outside, they needed a name. Silence only made things worse, but no one stepped forward. Outside, other witnesses described something different. They spoke about a woman pacing earlier in the evening, someone yelling threats, someone refusing to disengage even after police had left. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Not yet a suspect, but a direction. Multiple people described the same area of the courtyard, the same stretch of roadway, the same location near the playground, and they described a woman who had been visible long before the first shot. Detectives didn't yet know her role, but they knew one thing: Ariel didn't belong to the conflict. She had been walking away, and whatever happened next, whatever shots followed, the first bullet mattered more than all the others, because that first shot turned an argument into a homicide. And once that line was crossed, everything that followed became inevitable. In the hours after the shooting, Clark Gardens refused to settle. Police tape cordoned off parts of the courtyard, but people lingered just beyond it, watching, whispering, replaying the night in fragments. Everyone had a version of what happened, none of them fully matched. For detectives, that was the problem. They weren't dealing with silence, they were dealing with noise. Witnesses contradicted each other constantly. One person swore the first shots came from near the playground, another pointed toward the roadway, a third insisted it came from inside an apartment. Directions changed mid-sentence. Timelines blurred, emotions overtook accuracy. In shootings like this, confusion is expected. But what unsettled investigators was how confident people sounded, right up until their stories fell apart. Detectives started with Ariel's closest family members, hoping proximity would bring clarity. Her sister, who had been nearby when the shooting started, described hearing gunfire suddenly and feeling bullets hit the pavement near her feet. She ran. Everyone ran. By the time she reached Ariel, it was already too late. She couldn't say who fired first, only that the shots came from over there. Over there was everywhere. Officers then spoke with friends who had been standing close to Ariel. They confirmed she had not been arguing with anyone. She wasn't part of the earlier conflict. She had picked up her toddler and started toward home just moments before the shots began. That much stayed consistent. What didn't stay consistent was the origin of the gunfire. As detectives canvassed the complex, they noticed a pattern, not in what people said, but in what they avoided saying. Some witnesses lowered their voices when certain names came up. Others glanced around before answering. A few stopped talking entirely once questions got too specific. Fear was shaping the narrative. In communities like Clark Gardens, cooperation can feel dangerous. People worry about retaliation, about being labeled disloyal, about becoming the next target. That fear created gaps investigators had to push through. They moved apartment to apartment, pressing gently at first, then harder. They revisited witnesses, asking them to walk through the courtyard and physically point to where they were standing when the shots began. When witnesses were asked to stand where they had been, patterns emerged. Several pointed toward the same general area, a stretch of pavement near the playground and roadway intersection, a place where arguments had been flaring earlier in the evening, a place multiple people remembered someone standing and shouting, someone pacing, someone refusing to back down. That someone didn't yet have a name on paper, but detectives were getting closer. Then came the firearms. Inside one apartment near where Ariel fell, police recovered multiple guns. That discovery immediately escalated pressure. The men inside insisted they had nothing to do with the shooting. They claimed they had been inside playing video games when everything happened. Detectives weren't convinced. More than 70 shell casings had been recovered. That amount of gunfire didn't come from one weapon, and certainly not from nowhere. Officers confronted the group directly. "If you fired in retaliation, you need to tell us," one detective said. No one admitted to firing. No one admitted to seeing who fired, but everyone seemed to know who didn't. That contradiction mattered. As the night wore on, detectives began to separate rumor from repetition. Rumors shifted constantly, but repetition, the same detail coming from different people who didn't know each other, that carried weight. And one detail kept repeating. Multiple witnesses mentioned a woman who had been visible long before the shooting. She had been involved in the earlier argument. She had been shouting across the courtyard. She had been pacing back and forth, refusing to disengage even after police had left. Some described her hair. Some described her clothing. Others described what she was saying. The descriptions weren't identical, but they overlapped. Detectives began to realize they weren't dealing with a random shooter. They were dealing with escalation. The earlier fight wasn't resolved. It was postponed, and when police left, the pressure that had been building didn't release. It concentrated. Witnesses described the same sequence again and again. Police leave, people regroup, voices rise, someone moves toward the playground area. Then, gunfire. That timeline mattered. Detectives also noticed something else. Several witnesses said the first shots sounded different from the rest. Lower, more deliberate, not fired into the air, fired horizontally. After that, everything turned chaotic. Other guns came out. People fired wildly, some upward, some blindly. But by then, Ariel had already been hit, which meant the case hinged on one question: who fired the first shot? To answer that, detectives returned to the physical evidence. They mapped shell casings, angles, ricochet marks, and Ariel's wound trajectory. They overlaid that with witness positioning. The geometry started to make sense. If the first shot came from the area multiple witnesses pointed to, then it aligned with Ariel's location when she fell. It also explained why so many later shots missed everyone, panic firing without aim. The first shot wasn't panic, it was intentional. By the end of this phase, detectives weren't ready to name a suspect publicly, but privately, their focus had narrowed. They had a location, they had a sequence, they had a consistent description. What they didn't yet have was a moment of truth, someone willing to say clearly and directly what they saw. That moment was coming, and it wouldn't happen in an interrogation room. It would happen when grief collided with denial, and someone finally stopped protecting the truth. By the next morning, detectives were no longer chasing chaos, they were chasing consistency. The night before had been filled with noise, arguments, fear, half-finished sentences, and people pointing in every direction at once. But once investigators stepped back and compared statements side by side, something changed. Different witnesses, different locations, different relationships to the victim, yet the same name kept surfacing. At first, it appeared only in passing. A whisper, a side comment, a name dropped and quickly followed by silence. Detectives noticed how often people hesitated after saying it, how quickly they tried to redirect the conversation. That hesitation mattered. When fear surrounds a name, it usually means one of two things: the person is dangerous or the truth is uncomfortable. In this case, it was both. A woman at the center of the tension. Multiple witnesses independently described the same woman as being central to the earlier conflict. She had been arguing throughout the day. She had been loud. She had been visible. Most importantly, she had been armed, not hidden, not discreet. Visible. Several residents said they had seen her holding a gun long before the shooting started. Some described her pacing through the courtyard, the weapon at her side. Others recalled her yelling threats, daring people to come closer. Detectives paid close attention to how these descriptions overlapped. Different witnesses described her differently: hair color, clothing, tone, but the behavior remained the same. She wasn't running, she wasn't hiding, she wasn't caught off guard, she was posturing. That detail separated her from everyone else. Most people that night reacted after the gunfire started. This woman was acting before it ever began, mapping the first shot. To confirm what witnesses were saying, detectives returned to the physical evidence. They studied the shell casings again, focusing on the ones believed to be fired first. They examined the angles, the distances, and the location where Ariel had been standing. The trajectory told a clear story. The bullet that struck Ariel came from ground level, not from the air. It traveled horizontally across the courtyard, not upward or blindly. The first shooter wasn't firing randomly. The first shooter was aiming. Once that bullet hit Ariel, everything changed. Other people began firing, some in fear, some in retaliation, some without aim. That explained the sheer number of shell casings without additional victims, but none of that mattered legally, because the first shot carried the responsibility, and detectives now believed they knew exactly where it came from: the break in the wall. The investigation stalled briefly, not for lack of evidence, but for lack of cooperation. People knew what they'd seen. They just didn't want to say it out loud. That changed when grief cut through fear. Ariel's sister returned to Clark Gardens after leaving the hospital. She was exhausted, medicated, barely holding herself together. But she wasn't finished asking questions. She wanted answers. When she confronted the woman whose name had been circulating all night, the conversation started with denial. "I didn't shoot," the woman said, but denial doesn't survive pressure for long. As the conversation continued, the story shifted. First it became, "I didn't shoot at anyone." Then, "I only shot once." Then, "I shot toward the river." Each change mattered, because innocent people don't revise their story under pressure, they repeat it. The moment that sealed everything came when the denial collapsed entirely. In front of multiple people, the woman admitted she had fired a shot, just one. That admission landed with weight. Detectives would later confirm that this wasn't a confession in a police interview room. It wasn't recorded under interrogation. It happened organically, spoken in frustration, in panic, in the aftermath of loss, and it matched everything investigators already believed. Behavior after the shooting. Once detectives identified her as their primary suspect, they reviewed her actions after the shooting. Those actions told their own story. She gave a false name when first approached by police. She changed clothes shortly after the shooting. She attempted to stay inside multiple apartments instead of remaining visible. She left the area entirely, relocating to another county within hours. None of that proved guilt on its own, but together it painted a picture of someone who understood the seriousness of what had just happened and was trying to outrun it. Meanwhile, witnesses continued to come forward. Some spoke anonymously, others spoke reluctantly, but their accounts aligned. They described the same stance, the same location, the same weapon. They described her firing while walking forward, each shot getting closer. She was struck as the shooter advanced. The arrest detectives located the suspect in Cobb County within days. When officers approached her, there was no dramatic standoff, no chase, no resistance, just silence. She was taken into custody and transported back to Athens. The charges were severe: felony murder, aggravated assault, possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, false statements to law enforcement. Given the evidence and the nature of the crime, she was held without bond. From that moment forward, the investigation shifted into its final phase. The truth had surfaced. The shooter had been identified, and the case now belonged to the courtroom. But justice would not undo what happened in the courtyard. Ariel was still gone. Her unborn child was still gone. In the next part, the case moves from investigation to judgment, where every witness, every shell casing, and every word spoken that night would be tested under oath, and where the first shot would finally be held accountable. By the time the case reached court, the chaos of Clark Gardens had been stripped down to facts. What remained were timelines, trajectories, witness statements, and a single irreversible truth. The first shot mattered more than all the others combined. Prosecutors didn't argue that only one person fired a gun that night. What they argued, what they proved, was that only one person initiated the violence that made everything else possible. And that person was Caressa Cooper, building the case. In court, the state reconstructed the night step by step. Jurors heard from witnesses who had no connection to one another, who stood in different locations, and who were interviewed separately. The same posture, the same position in the courtyard. They described a gun held low, not fired into the air, not waved wildly, but leveled toward people. Ballistics evidence supported those accounts. The trajectory of the bullet that killed Ariel Thump Calloway matched the location witnesses placed Caressa when the first shot was fired. It was a ground-level shot, fired horizontally, consistent with intentional aim. That bullet struck Ariel while she was walking away, carrying her toddler. Everything that followed, every panicked round, every retaliatory shot, came after. Legally, that distinction was everything. Under Georgia law, the person who initiates deadly violence is responsible for the consequences that flow from it, even if others fire afterward. The court didn't need to prove Caressa fired every shot. They only needed to prove she fired the first one. The evidence showed she did. The admission that changed everything. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence didn't come from a police interrogation. It came from a moment of grief and confrontation. Jurors heard how Ariel's sister, still reeling from the loss, confronted Caressa after returning from the hospital. They heard how Caressa initially denied everything, then slowly shifted her story. "I didn't shoot. I didn't shoot at anyone. I only shot once." That admission mattered. It wasn't coerced. It wasn't misunderstood. It wasn't taken out of context. It aligned with the physical evidence, the witness accounts, and Caressa's behavior after the shooting. The jury didn't see it as a slip. They saw it as truth breaking through pressure. Behavior. After the shooting, the prosecution also highlighted what Caressa did after the gunfire stopped. She gave police a false name. She changed clothes. She avoided direct contact with officers. She left the county within hours. None of those actions proved guilt on their own, but together they painted a picture of consciousness of guilt, someone who understood the seriousness of what had happened and acted accordingly. The defense attempted to argue fear and confusion. They suggested Caressa panicked like everyone else, but panic doesn't explain lying. Panic doesn't explain relocation. Panic doesn't explain admission followed by denial. The jury didn't accept it. The verdict after deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Caressa Cooper was convicted of felony murder in the death of Ariel Thump Calloway. Additional convictions followed for aggravated assault, possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, and false statements. Under Georgia law, the killing of a pregnant woman carries heightened gravity. Ariel's unborn child was recognized as a second victim under state statute, adding weight to the sentencing phase. Caressa Cooper was sentenced to life in prison. No possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. The aftermath for the family. For Ariel's family, the verdict didn't bring relief. It brought finality. There was no celebration, no sense of closure, just the knowledge that the person responsible would never walk free again, and that Ariel would never walk at all. Her toddler would grow up with stories instead of memories, stories about a mother who was gentle, who was protective, who was walking home when violence found her. Family members spoke of the hole Ariel's death left behind. Not just emotionally, but practically. Birthdays missed, first days of school without her, a future rewritten in a single moment. They didn't talk about revenge, they talked about absence. A community forced to reckon Clark Gardens changed after the shooting. Neighbors who once gathered in the courtyard avoided it. Parents kept children indoors. The casual tolerance for arguments and shouting, the belief that nothing ever really happens, was gone. Residents were left with a hard truth. Violence doesn't need planning to be deadly. It doesn't need hatred to escalate. It only needs one person willing to pull the trigger first. That first shot created a chain reaction no one could stop. Why the first shot matters. Dozens of people fired guns that night, but only one person transformed a tense argument into a homicide. The law recognizes that distinction because without it, accountability disappears into confusion. The first shot is the line between anger and murder. Once crossed, everything else becomes consequence. Ariel's legacy. Ariel Thump Calloway didn't choose any of this. She didn't choose the argument. She didn't choose the gun. She didn't choose the violence. She chose to go home with her child. That choice should have ended her night safely. Instead, it ended her life. Her story stands as a reminder of how quickly ordinary moments can turn irreversible, and how silence, pride, and escalation can destroy lives far beyond the people directly involved. Justice, in this case, came through truth, slowly, painfully, and only after many voices finally spoke. But justice can never replace what was lost. It can only ensure that the first shot is never forgotten. What happened in Clark Gardens reminds us how quickly everyday conflict can turn fatal, and how one moment of violence can destroy generations of lives. Ariel Thump Calloway was walking home with her child, planning a future that was taken from her in seconds. Justice may have been served in court, but the loss her family carries will never fade. If stories like this matter to you, stories that uncover truth, accountability, and the real cost of violence, subscribe to the channel. Share this video so these victims are never forgotten. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next case.